Schönen Nachmittag. Zum wiederholten Mal nicht, dass wir uns in die Augen sehen können. Das gilt auch für die Sprecherinnen und Sprecher. Mein Name ist Michael Stampfer. Ich komme vom WWTF, einen der 3 Co-Organisatoren dieser Veranstaltungsreihe. Ich werde dann gleich noch was sagen, warum wir auch hier sind als Forschungsförderer. Möchte aber zuerst sagen, von wo aus zumindest ich sitzen darf und sprechen darf, nämlich von der wunderbaren Central European University. Die CEU ist ein großartiger Platz, sozialwissenschaftliche Forschung und Lehre zu betreiben. Und wir sind alle wahnsinnig stolz hier in Wien, dass die CEU zwar nicht freiwillig, aber Budapest verlassen musste, aber sich freiwillig für Wien als Ort für ihre neue Heimat gesucht hat. Da das eine sehr internationale Universität ist, läuft im Hintergrund auch ein englischsprachiger Übersetzungsstream, also alle Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer können sich auch ins Englische umschalten und alle Zuhörerinnen und Zuhörer sind ultimativ aufgefordert, sobald ihnen was einfällt, auch eine entsprechende Frage in den Chat zu schreiben. Wir haben ausführlich Zeit, dann auch, vielleicht nicht alle, aber die allermeisten Fragen zu beantworten. Dank auch an den zweiten Mitveranstalter, an die Arbeiterkammer. Die Arbeiterkammer ist ein wunderbarer Partner dafür, weil sie 2 Dinge vereint, ihre langjährige, ich glaube über 100 Jahre Einstehen für Arbeitnehmerinnen und Arbeitnehmerrechte und seit einigen Jahren ein forciertes Engagement für die Digitalisierung, und wir werden auch aus dem Digitalisierungsfonds der Arbeiterkammer ein gefördertes, wunderschönes Projekt heute kennenlernen. Und wir vom WWTF sind Anstifter einer Idee, die sich digitaler Humanismus nennt, die in einem Satz zusammengefasst das sagt: liebe Leute, wenn wir wollen, dass unsere schönen zivilisatorischen Errungenschaften, soziale Marktwirtschaft, Rechtsstaat, Menschenrechte, Diskurs, wenn das die Plattformökonomien überleben soll, dann müssen wir eine Menge dafür tun, dass das auch weiterhin und auch im digitalen Bereich so bleibt. Wir werden heute ein paar Dinge sehen, warum das so ist. Schöne Grüße von der Rektorin der Universität, der CEU, Shalini Randeria. Eigentlich sollte sie jetzt die Einleitungsworte sprechen, ist aber in einem anderen Meeting gefangen. Ich unterstelle ihr, sie wäre lieber bei uns. Wer sind wir, bevor ich zum Thema komme? Ein großartiges Panel. Zuerst wird Christian Korunka uns eine Keynote halten. Komme dann gleich noch einmal darauf zurück. Christian Korunka ist Professor für Arbeits- und Gesundheitspsychologie und Organisationspsychologie an der Fakultät für Psychologie der Universität Wien, forscht seit vielen Jahrzehnten zu Veränderungsprozessen in der Arbeitswelt und zu dieser wichtigen Frage auch, was bedeutet das individuell, was bedeutet das für Personen, was bedeutet das für Werthaltungen, was bedeutet das auch für Zufriedenheit. Hat das auch in den USA als Gastprofessor schon mehrfach getan, ist Doktoratstudienprogrammleiter an der Fakultät für Psychologie und auch Supervisor und personenzentrierter Psychotherapeut. Next in line, Magister Caroline Krammer. Sie ist Expertin aus der Abteilung Sozialversicherung und Sozialrecht in der AK Wien, ist eine Juristin und ist in den Bereichen sowohl Digitalisierung als auch Sozialversicherung als auch Gesundheitspolitik eine Expertin, die sowohl im Analysebereich als auch im beratenden und gestaltenden Bereich tätig ist. Ausarbeitung rechtspolitischer, rechtswissenschaftlicher Positionen zu genannten Themen wie eben Gesundheit, Pflege, Pflegereform und eben auch zunehmend Fragen der Arbeit, Plattformarbeit, der digitalisierten Arbeit. Und von ihr werden wir auch einiges hören, was sich in Österreich in der realen Arbeitswelt hier so abspielt, wenn wir über das Thema Digitalisierung, Plattformökonomie und Prekarisierung reden. Doktorin Sabine Koch ist die Geschäftsführerin von Smart Coop Austria. Sie ist promovierte Philosophin und Kulturwissenschaftlerin. Wir haben schon etwas bis hin zur kritischen Theorie im Vorbereitungsgespräch schon einen ersten kleinen Ausflug gemacht, ist langjährige Geschäftsführerin der IG Freien Theaterarbeit, Vorsitzende des Kulturrates und eben Geschäftsführerin von Smart Coop Austria. Das ist eine solidarökonomische Genossenschaft für Kunstschaffende, Kreative, neue Selbstständige, die eben die Vorteile der freiberuflichen Arbeit mit den Vorteilen einer sozialen Absicherung und auch einer organisatorischen Einbettung verbindet. Und Frau Koch wird uns auch einiges erzählen, dass Österreich nicht das einzige Land ist, wo solche Initiativen sind, sondern dass das eine zum Glück wachsende internationale Initiative ist. International ist auch ein Stichwort für Professorin Monika Mühlböck, die am Department für Politikwissenschaftlerin der CEU Politikwissenschaften der CEU gerade Gastwissenschaftlerin ist, die an der CEU am Institut für höhere Studien und an der Universität Wien tätig ist, die aber lange auch in Mannheim am Zentrum für europäische Sozialforschung, einem Hotspot der Sozialwissenschaften in Europa, gearbeitet hat. Und sie steigt jetzt sehr stark im IHS als Senior Researcher seit Juli 2021 für Themen Bildung und Arbeit ein. Last not least, Jörg Flecker. Der Jörg und ich kennen uns spätestens seit Mitte der 90er Jahre, daher werde ich hier auch das Sie nicht durchhalten. Jörg ist Professor für Soziologie an der Uni Wien und Gründungsmitglied und Vorsitzender des Vorstands von Forba. Das ist ein hochinitiativer Forschungsverein und auch eine Beratungsstelle für Fragen der Arbeitswelt. Und Jörg, du bist einer der ersten auch gewesen, die eben diese Fragen, was macht nicht nur Telearbeit, sondern eben was macht dieses entfernte Arbeiten, was macht das auch aus den Arbeitsbeziehungen, aus Forba und ist auch früh in die Frage IT und Arbeit hineingegangen, Flexibilisierung. Du hast auch eine IHS-Vergangenheit, eine Vergangenheit auch als Research Fellow in Großbritannien und du warst eben bis 2013 der wissenschaftliche Leiter auch von Forba und seit 2013 bist du Professor für Soziologie an der Universität Wien. Also eine super Truppe, deren Auftritt ich noch 2 Minuten aufhalte mit dem Geruch von Pizza. Stellen Sie sich vor, Frau Koch, ich habe Ihnen etwas gefladert, nämlich dieses Beispiel, das ich jetzt gerade bringe. Stellen Sie sich vor, Sie sind in einer schönen Stadt in den USA und denken, now a pizza, please. Ja, und
wonderful place in the United States, and you phone to get a huge pizza delivered to your home. But the interesting thing is the call center agent is in India and takes an order for deep dish pizza with cheese on the top and passes it on to the pizza chain. But he is in a very remote place. He is in India, which is a good example of an earning cooperative of 1 million members. We haven't come quite as far. However, of the average earning, the average income of someone living here in Vienna, a creative worker, a programmer who is freelance and no longer employed, which wasn't quite a voluntary decision. And the employer might be cutting the wages and social security benefits of the employees by pointing out that there are platform workers who can do this at lower cost. So when we talk about work in the digital age, we also need to work about rights, about organization, and ways of developing without becoming unhappy. So the focus here is precariat and working life, the working poor possibly. But what we are looking for is that we can stay people who are happy and satisfied and able to cover their needs. But platform work is possible for an ever-growing number of groups of occupations. They are driven to platforms, and employers are able to use platform work in their core processes. We will also talk about one-person businesses. We will work about ways and means of getting organized as this type of business owner or worker. We will also start talking about bundling interests and the risks that somebody who has a nice employment contract cannot even imagine. Now's the time to actually stop talking and give the floor to Christian Korunka for his keynote address. And after his keynote address, we're going to have 2 rounds on the panel, and in the second round, at the latest, we will also try to respond to questions from the audience. Mr. Korunka, you have the floor, and thank you for being with us. Thank you very much for the invitation to this interesting event. I really enjoyed preparing for this. I actually was prompted to change the title of my paper after the meetings in a sociological framework, and actually I'm going to ask about what decent or humane work is, which is basically a normative framework. Psychologically, we would be developing a framework that we can expand. I actually never really looked at the UN Declaration of Human Rights from close up, but now that the document is older than 70 years now, I read up on Article 23, which describes decent work or humane work as a human right. This is about protection against unemployment. This is about favorable conditions of work. It is about equal pay for equal work. It is about humaneness on the whole, about human dignity, and also the right to get organized. So this is a rather large framework, and the question is whether the call center agent in India actually has a job that is worthy of human dignity. Of course, we might say that this is still the case. It might never be the case. It pays off to look at it more closely. What are the characteristics of work that is worthy of human dignity. We have Hackers and Richter's activity regulation theory, which actually started out in the GDR, was then transferred to the Federal Republic of Germany. And this deals with a hierarchical model of characteristics. It starts with feasibility. It moves on to the fact that work should be harmless. And of course, we need to differentiate here. The question is whether work causes harm or damage, physical harm, occupational accidents would be a case in point. Of course, this is possible. It gets even clearer when we talk about freedom from impairment. It's not so easy to fulfill if you think of stress levels, for example. And there is also a positive criterion, and that is the development of personality. Work that is worthy of human dignity is not just feasible and harmless or impairment-free, but also conducive to personality development. And this is really a very central criterion if we look at it from a point of view of humanism. The Hackman-Oldham theory is more task-related. Hacker actually focused on objective characteristics, whereas the American theory is more subjectivistic, and you can see that there is skill variety, task identity, significance, etc. And the question is, how do people actually experience this? A good job is not monotonous. It requires a variety of skills. It's holistic in the sense of including targets as well as planning elements. So it is kind of an integrated job. It is a job that is significant for the worker, him or herself, and others. It's not just work that you enjoy, but it is also something that is meaningful for society. And then there are two central criteria: autonomy, participation, freedom of decision-making, and if that is not present, it's not worthy of human dignity. And you also need feedback. You need to know why you are doing things. And if we think back on the call center agent, it will be relatively easy to assess this. It's relatively remote from work worthy of human dignity. Although from a human rights perspective, certain points might be fulfilled. Of course, we can also think about fundamental needs. There is Rein's and Deasy's self-determination theories with 3 or 4 very central characteristics as autonomy or self-determination. There is competence, know-how, curiosity, career opportunities. Then there is relatedness. You are involved and embedded in a social context together with others, and then there is structure and safety as the 4 basic characteristics. That sounds very simple, but it's highly complex. Structure gets more difficult if you think of structures dissolving and a necessity to create your own structures when you work from home. Autonomy too. A lot of autonomy, that's the old idea, is good. I mean, we really have to think about too much autonomy when we think along the modern lines of structure and safety. So on the one hand, we have something normative. On the other hand, we also have to look at it in a very differentiated way. These are the global trends. Of course, it's no coincidence that the call center agent is located in India. Globalization is key. The economic crises have contributed to that. Without information and communication technology, it wouldn't be possible actually to use all the tools, and the COVID-19 pandemic really exacerbates and accelerates all these developments. At one point, we will have to think about what work will be like after the pandemic. New groups at risk have formed. This is actually from market research, and there was a representative survey in which people were asked who was especially at risk of losing his or her job due to digitalization and technical progress. And you can see that it's people who are not well educated, who are older, who are manual workers, blue-collar workers, returnees to the job, migrants, etc., etc. And this actually tallies with the view that experts take. Another major topic behind it, it's one of my favorite quotes, and I have to admit I haven't read War and Peace. It says, I took a course in fast reading, in speed reading, and now I'm able to read War and Peace in 20 minutes. It's a book about Russia. So I really like that quote, but actually we pay the price of acceleration. We actually looked at the theory of social acceleration by Rosa very often and in great detail. And of course, we know that he is an interesting thinker in terms of psychology, and social acceleration is really a very comprehensive theory. There are three facets to it. One is technological acceleration, which is related to acceleration in the rhythm of life, the speed of life, and also social change. The European Working Conditions Survey has actually confirmed this. So in empirical research, we've seen that happen. Work has intensified in terms of speed as a consequence of social acceleration. This is a representative survey, cross-section of various countries, and you can see various degrees of increase, but the basic pattern is acceleration going up. At present, we seem to have reached a plateau, a cap, and Eastern Europe is obviously catching up in this process, and it's even accelerating faster. Even if we interpret these figures very carefully. Of course, flexibility is a central characteristic of new work, and it has various dimensions. One could simply look at numerical flexibility, flexibility in terms of time and space, and I'll briefly talk about each of these points. Numerical flexibility has to be assessed very critically in terms of work worthy of human dignity. Think of temporary work. If you have to lease out workers, and if you depend on those to whom you lease out workers, this has hardly anything to do with work that is worthy of human dignity. The auto industry is a case in point here, and you can see that the curve always goes up after crises. And of course, you can imagine what things will be like in COVID times. These are actually data from Germany, but you get more or less of the same picture in Austria. Crowdsourcing work, also a very interesting thing. I looked at psychological studies about this, and what you find are, of course, very flashy quotes like the internet is enabling a new kind of poorly paid hill. Studies that deal with quality of work are actually hard to find. But what we have shows us a low degree of satisfaction, a low degree of loyalty, but we can also see a change in the picture. This study by Brawley and Puri is from 2016, and you can see a shift in the classic characteristics, but in terms of trend, things are still critical. What about flexibility in terms of time? In terms of location, of course, working from home, telework is important here. Up to 18 of people in the EU can be considered work that is flexible in terms of location. That's quite a lot, but it's only 1/5 of all work available. So we need to put this into perspective. We actually have to think of people who are always there, always available. That's 43%. And a lot of work is still conventional, telework or conventional work. But the reddish yellow piece of the cake is getting ever bigger. What is part of that? Of course, there is classic telework and work from home. When we use the English term home office in German, it's a bit cynical because it means that we actually work from the kitchen table, and it's not ergonomically perfect. Of course, there is also highly mobile work, and there are new office concepts which have been implemented in large corporations, with the German Post, many big insurance companies, the desk sharing concepts that make people more flexible. And there is also concepts like Amazon Turk. The COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, massively accelerated this development. We also have numerous studies for this because work and family, children, balancing that is coming to the fore for the first time. Many people work from home for the first time. It's for the first time that people have their children at home because schools are closed, and it's a challenge to executives. In a qualitative study, you will find statements like, I work more than ever, almost everything can be done from home, there are no boundaries between work and leisure time anymore, meetings are really strenuous, impossible with children, etc., etc. As for the studies or surveys, what we find in them is ambivalent, and really the phenomena are paradoxical. There is better work-life balance, but also more conflicts between work and private life, fewer interruptions and distractions. So there is a potential for opportunities, but there are also challenges. And of course, social isolation is an important isolation. Maybe the call center agent, who I imagine to be a man, would be sitting all alone in a small flat in India. That's the the picture that I have in mind. And of course, there is quite some evidence that shows that this is the case, that there is a lack of social support. And of course, there's less opportunity to develop a career. And this takes me to the end of my keynote. I tried to come up with a couple of theories. On the one hand, work is subject to ongoing technological development that needs to be reassessed all the time. I've actually worked with this for decades, which makes me think. I actually did my first surveys and studies when people started using personal computers, and the question was the same. And people dealt with issues of screen quality and backaches. So you always have to assess and reassess. Per se, I would say digital work has to fulfill the criteria of work worthy of human dignity, just like analog work does, and it is possible. But the criteria of work that is worthy of human dignity are actually stable over time. So real digital humanism in the world of work has to identify and consider these normative concepts that remain the same over time. What is a good job? In the sense of a good position, good work. All the threats, the risks, the precariat, a lack of structure and security, a lack of meaning. Basically, the call center agent is very much like a conveyor belt worker. So there are threats and there are risks. The perspective has to be as integrated and holistic as possible, because there is also a tendency towards polarization. And this has to be identified. This will happen after COVID. We will have to deal with it. There will be winners and losers in this new world of work. And at present, we are looking at strong and weak situations. Strong situations are those with strong framework conditions, strong boundary conditions. A 9-to-5 job where you start working at 9 and where you stop working at 5 p.m. A strong situation would be an opportunity to do what you want to do. And this is when people are actually returned to their own skills. Some people are self-regulating, others don't do so well. So for the very first time, the models underlying these various perspectives of work go to show that some people do better than others. So boundary conditions for polarization are actually created. And I believe that the perspective that we need to take must be extremely extensive. And that's going to be something that we need to deal with for a long time to come. Thank you very much. Professor Korunka, I actually did not pay attention for a minute because I thought about War and Peace. There is a large group of people in that novel who do work that is not worthy of human dignity, and a large group that don't have to work at all. And there is a description of an analog job with 30 pages devoted to hunting hares in the winter. Actually, the 30 pages about that quickly read. Ms. Kramer. Internet is enabling a new kind of poorly paid hell. What are your experiences there? Would that apply to your job as an analyst, as an advisor? Well, my experience is multifaceted, and thank you very much for having invited me. We heard a few things about the boundaries that are removed in terms of location, in terms of time, and something that we are faced with a lot in our advisory work is legal lack of boundaries, because in the digital sector, many jobs are characterized by vacillating between employment and self-employment and don't fit into the existing legal framework. And that is something that might sound fairly theoretical, but it has very practical consequences for the people concerned. And maybe I can give you an example there. The delivery services like Nyam or Lieferando here in Austria, where people ride bikes delivering food, and they get their orders via an internet platform. And for one and the same job, different laws apply. Some are marginal part-timers, others are employees, others are freelancers under a contract for work. And that is not just interesting from a legal point of view, it also has major consequences for those concerned. For example, about when it comes to continuation of pay when they are sick. Do they get sick pay? Are they entitled to paid leave? And now during the pandemic, we've seen that the legal classification is really very important when it comes to eligibility for support under the COVID assistance. There was no short-term work for some of the delivery people, and the marginal part-timers did not get any unemployment benefits because they're not entitled to it. And in the pandemic, we've seen the enormous consequences of these fundamental legal issues. Ms. Kramer, can we also say that whenever there are disruptions, be it turbo capitalism or be it digitalization at its best, that capitalism does better because regulations are not actually catching up with developments, and that there is kind of a regulatory void or a legislative void in the labor market, so that the freedom that workers have is more extensive. Well, that's a possible interpretation, but it's a matter of political will. Under national law, it depends on whether you are willing to come up with legislation that supports all these workers. In Austria, as regards social security, we actually have a fairly sound basis, and we cover a lot, even people in the precariat that we might look at in greater detail in the next hour, have a quite good extent of social security. But it's really, really up to political will. Of course, we will also come back to platform economy and the problem of coming up with legislation there, which is harder than in analog forms of work. But can you tell us a little about orders of magnitude? Are we still talking about a marginal phenomenon, or is it a substantial part of the labor market? Well, I think, first of all, we need to define what the precariat really means and what the platform means and the share economy. As for precariat, I was in Salzburg at a very interesting event last week, and Professor Dimmel talked about the topic, and I would like to share the definition. He used the following criteria. Precariat means low income, hourly wage below the minimum income, no formal training required, a very high risk of unemployment, more stress and more health risks, more health hazards, no obligatory social security, no employment law protection, no permanent jobs, and no co-determination as regards the working conditions. And if at least 3 of these criteria apply, we can actually talk about precariat. And given the figures in Austria, and I looked at the social security data, where there are stable figures, we have 340,000 marginal part-timers, 15,000 low-income employees. The numbers have remained fairly stable, and in spite of the pregnancy, the pandemic, and the share of small-scale enterprises, one-person businesses, 60% of all self-employed persons, and 47.3% of women work part-time if they are employed. So some of the factors can be found in the employed population of Austria. Specifically about platform work, it's a bit difficult to find figures. There are studies, 673 platforms exist Europe-wide, and 2.3% of the population in the age of employment work there. 6% gain a major income from there, and 8% do digital platform work at least once a month. In Austria, there's a 2016 online survey. 18% of respondents said that they worked via platforms in the past year. And 5% used a platform at least once a week, 8% at least once a month. Those were the figures I found. Thank you very much. That's quite important. It's an important framework. These are not so small figures, so not so low, and this is only precariat and its platforms, but there are several overlapping groups of problems that we cannot separate.
There are also ways to be organized and to be loyal to each other, and that's where I'll be led to Ms. Koch with my next question. I'm, dated back to analog times, and I still have LPs. And I have a few LPs by Frank Zappa, and in one of them, he talks about American pizzas in between two songs. And he says that all the ugly, waxy, fake kind of cheese on top that never belonged to a pizza in the first place, but the American people really like it, is what he says there. And probably that doesn't quite cover it. And that doesn't really mean that we should congratulate the Indian platform employees to have to advertise these pizzas. What do you think? Well, first of all, thanks a lot for having me. And I would like to come back to India in a bit, but I'd like to start out with Austria. And since you've mentioned it, though, let me start with the following. Unlike the participants here on the panel who are quite critical of the platform movement, I myself, I come from the platform co-ops movement. We're sort of a counter movement to this. And globally, it has meant that people have organized themselves and have come together digitally. And one of the examples that you mentioned is that 1 million Indian beauty workers have come together in a platform co-op. And that platform has helped them work in less precarious circumstances. They have had better pay, they have had more democratic participatory rights, etc. And on top of that, they have been able to form a network that has provided them with security. They had a call line that they could call because the safety risks are quite high in India. So they had a helpline. And that's a great example of a wonderful cooperative. But first of all, I'd like to introduce what we with the SMART platform are doing. As you have mentioned in your introduction, I used to be CEO of the free theatre industry, and I've worked at the Culture Council for a long time. And I have done a lot of advocacy work against these precarious working conditions in the arts and cultural sector. And that has led me to have this idea about the SMART co-op. What is it exactly? Well, it's asking how we can change these working conditions that switch so quickly between being self-employed and then being employed. And that, because that often means that you have to be insured multiple times. So how can we change this system in a way that enables us to avoid outsourcing to one-person businesses and increases freelance work? But how can we get a new dynamic there? And that's what we're trying to do with SMART. We want to conjoin those lone fighters and help them and support them. So all these people used to, fight their own battles and had to, fight bureaucracy, fight all the administrative issues. And under the roof of our cooperative, they can come together, they can work on projects together, they can file projects together. And within this cooperative, they can also become employed. And at the same time, all these people are owners of the cooperative and they're also employees of it. And the following happens when we do this. It's basically a new type of work, if you will, because that's one of our slogans as well. It connects the freedom of self-employment with the safety and security of employment and social inclusion. And that includes many different groups of people. And in order to make this a bit more tangible for you, let me give you a few examples. We've got a number of musicians, for example, who for the last 4 years have put all their gigs into SMART and have therefore created an employment for this entire period of time. We have got theatre people, for example, who become employed for the duration of one project and can therefore save money and make sure that they get unemployment funds after the project. So we're also active on a very international level. And that means that if, you know, the musicians, for example, have gigs abroad, they still remain employed within the smart cooperative and therefore still remain part of the Austrian social security system, for example. May I just interrupt you for 1 second, because you said something really important there. You said that you were the first person who basically said that the social security system in Austria is comfortable, and that's a really nice thing, because I think we should have a comfortable life, a good life, and that's something that everyone deserves. So I'm really touched that you really mentioned our social security system in an affirmative manner. Yes, I did. But as Ms. Kramer said, for many of the people who work in this new type of employment no longer have access to this system, to this welfare system. And that's what SMART is trying to work against, meaning that a number of small projects can come together and create employment within the smart cooperative. And many people have started doing this with our cooperative. To give you a few numbers, we've got 1,300 users at the moment, and on average, we've got between 60 and 70 employees at the moment. Half of our active users, in order to look back on COVID, let me tell you this, half of our users have been working on short-term contracts since then, and have therefore been able to be eligible for subsidies that have come up during the pandemic in Austria. What else is there for me to tell you? SMART is not just active in Austria. The basic idea, I think, has evolved in Belgium about 20 years ago. Belgium is, similar in size to Austria, and SMART has evolved in the poorer areas of Belgium. And there, it's also connected to certain changes in the legal framework, and it has really grown there. They have 85,000 users there at the moment. They're not all employed at the same time, but very many of them have actually led to a system change in the country. These people, 10,000 of them really, have created inclusion here, and they are now able to get unemployment money, for example. And they have also created the opportunity to become employed, for example, if you are busking on the street or if you're a babysitter. And that's what SMART is trying to do. We're trying to be a new growing roof under which people can come together and have regular working times and be employed. And our cooperative exists in 8 countries now. It's an international network, really. I think it's really important to realize now that there are counter strategies. I learned before this meeting that there is one branch of your work that enables access to the social system, and that also makes it easier to get organized. For example, if you need, software for your work, if you need resources for your office, etc., and you can share these resources within the cooperative. So there's multiple benefits to such a cooperative, really. And before we move on to Mr. Flecker, just one last thing. In the US and also in other countries, there's plenty of examples of these cooperatives. Do you maybe have just 1 minute left to give us international examples of these cooperatives? Yes, definitely. I was gonna get back to that in the second round of questions. So there are great things happening, and maybe one example off the top of my head is Uber, for example, the taxi business. And just now, an initiative has come up in New York by New York taxi drivers. 400 drivers have already entered the market, and they are very cooperative structure and platform as well. Excellent. Well, then let's get back to that in the second round. Maybe that was a bit going a bit too fast. Just for your information, we've got a few links that we collected for you in the chat, where you can find out more about SMART and other topics. So if you would like to take a look at the chat, or maybe add your own comments there, please address them to myself and not IT or the host. Please address them to me. You can choose it in the little drop-down menu, and that way I can see your questions. Mr. Flecker, in your research, you deal a lot with the topic of platform economy, especially from a sociological perspective. What kind of tensions do you see in this interplay between employees, employers, and also platform providers? Because they are often considered the kind of third party in this interplay. What evidence is there for you? What tensions have you noticed? Well, thank you for the invitation also from my side. And to your question, well, these sort of triangular relationships is something that's been known for a while, for example, for contract work, temporary work, etc. This is one of the classic examples, really, where we have to deal with these three different rules. The difference may be that temporary or contract work, at least in Austria, unlike in Germany, is more regulated. And that means that the platforms play a slightly different role than other people in this relationship. I think we have to distinguish between those who are fixed in place, so platforms who are for people who are fixed in place, for example, delivery services, taxi services, etc. And then we have platforms for online work, for digital work. Because these two are quite different. And when it comes to the former, there's also, different facets, really. Some are sort of like a phone book, really. And we've had attempts from the Economic Chamber during the pandemic to have platforms like that. And I think Ms. Koch has also mentioned the cooperative platforms. But there are also platforms that are integrated into companies, for example, Amazon and others, who also organize their own delivery services. And when it comes to that, quite often the problem is that if the platform plays a more important role other than just being informational, then the issue is quite often that, for example, the drivers or the delivery people are employed, but in a sort of fake freelance contract, and basically what they're offering are services. Microwork is similar to that when it comes to online work and digital online work. Mr. Korunka has already mentioned it. Mechanical Turk was one of the examples of tiny little tasks like typing up shopping lists are then being paid with a few cents, and then if you do thousands of those, maybe you've accumulated enough money to buy your own lunch. So when it comes to this, it's often that bigger companies organize this kind of work. It's also referred to as digital terrorism, because it basically goes against all criteria of dignified work that Mr. Korunka mentioned. But these platforms can be regulated, and there are attempts of regulating them to introduce minimum wages, for example, for these microtasks. Another thing we have to distinguish from that is the type of online work for graphic design, for example, translation services, software development, etc., where this is being conveyed, this usually requires the employees to be high skilled, and that means that usually these platforms are more than just intermediaries who sort of mediate between contractors and contract givers. This is where we see, when we did research on this, especially when it comes to creative work, we have seen the effects of it, and they are that more platforms are sort of sprouting up in these industries, and they have an effect on the working conditions. Can you talk a little bit about the individual features and characteristics of these platforms from your experience and from your projects? Because to me, it's quite difficult to tell, you know, what does Manchester capitalism mean and what is more platform specific, because of this independence where we can cross huge distances because of the digital platforms. So this kind of independence is difficult for me to distinguish from other factors, because that does make it more easy to organize, to sort of separate different tasks. So maybe you can touch upon that a little bit. Yes, well, it definitely depends on which type of architecture these platforms have and what it means to work via these platforms. Usually, there are certain measures such as how is communication organized, how is everything displayed, how are the people who offer their services via the platform being displayed, what do their profiles look like, how can they shape their own profiles, for example, how can customers evaluate the work and the services they have received. And that brings certain effects, meaning the platforms try, and this is basically about online project work, for example, translation or software development. So these platform providers try to sort of bind their contractors to themselves. And how can they do that if they are not really employers and there's not really any contract? This can be done by saying that if you want to provide your services via this platform, you do depend on how customers have reviewed you. You know, it's basically just like hotels. You need 5 stars for people to come and want these services. And it's hard work to earn these 5 stars, for example. So this might be one of the rules. Or another rule is that you have to pass a test on the platform in order to be more popular. Or you have to pay in order to pop up in areas that more customers will be able to access. So these are all different criteria that depend on how you can shape your reputation on this platform. And the reputation is something that we've learned from creative work, of course, from other areas, for example, from the offline world. For example, in a city, you do need a certain reputation if you want to work as a creative and if you want to have a business there. But the difference is that this type of display is determined by the platform quite powerfully, really. How can you get this reputation? How can you earn it? And how is it displayed to customers? This is where the platforms have a lot of power. And then there's also other features where platforms try to undermine the direct contact between service providers and customers. So there are algorithms that will always monitor this, you know, how available are people, how quickly will they reply to requests from potential customers or interested parties. And when it comes to that, it gets quite interesting, doesn't it? Because we not only have the control by customers and their reviews, etc., but we also are being monitored by the platform providers and we're being evaluated by them. And that can make it very difficult. For example, we had an interview with someone who said that they were trying to set their account on inactive for a week because I was on vacation, and that was denied by the platform, and basically meant that this person had to keep working while being on vacation because they were too afraid to lose their status on the platform. So it's quite limiting oftentimes because of how these platforms are set up and because of the power that they have. When it comes to looms or coal mines, for example, Ms. Mühlböck, it also took some time, but at some point the legislators stood up and made decisions because there was a lot of rioting going on within these groups and to regulate these industries. So it seems to be a recurring phenomenon, right, that the society does have an impact on the legislator, even though it takes them a while to react. Maybe you can comment on that a little bit in terms of platform work and new types of work and labor. Is there a gap, do you think, between the legislators' work and regulations that sprout up from them and what's actually going on in reality? Hello, yes, and thank you for the invitation. Digitization in general and platform economy in particular have gained more and more importance in recent years, and we've heard so many examples already in this session of what this means for the labor market, for social security in the future. And on the Institute for Higher Studies, before I started working there, an interesting study was conducted on how digitization affects different areas of work. In general, I think we can say that the scope of the phenomenon of digitization and platform economy in particular requires political regulation, of course. However, Austrian politics are lagging behind the social and also the economic realities, not just in terms of this question, but especially in terms of this question as well. So when politics do something, it's a reaction more than it is proactive. So the issue that we've been seeing for a while now is that politics is losing its ideology. And in order to be active, you have to know where you want to go. And in order to know where you want to go, you really need to have this reduction of complexities that really only works with ideologies, right? So what happens because of this reduction of ideology? What happens is the following. Politics doesn't have its own ideas anymore, but it's driven by the public opinion and then listens to those who shout the loudest, basically. And society tends to react more to the things that already exist and not so much to the things that should be there in the future. So the question is it really bad if politics focuses more on administration and not so much on creation? I think that's a normative question that I don't think we can answer with simply yes or no. I think we need a certain pragmatism and we need to listen to the needs and desires, and we need to wait a little bit on the developments and what happens there, because that can be a positive thing, right? The question remains is, how is Austria doing in an international context if we compare it to other countries? And I've got a little a picture that I would like to show you. Here we go. This was carried out by Kielhofer et Alteri, commissioned by the European Commission, where national experts were surveyed on what has happened already in the individual countries in terms of platform work, how much regulations exist already. And what we can see here in this very quantitative display is that Austria isn't really doing very well, is it? So legislation in Austria is still very much lacking. What we are seeing is case laws. For example, in terms of Uber, we have seen that this has happened. And another thing that we've been seeing is actions as regards social partnerships. Another thing we're seeing in this study is that other countries have been doing really well, especially Italy, Spain, France, but also Germany have come a lot further than Austria has.
Aber auch die Frage, ist das wirklich dramatisch für Österreich?
Another question is that really so bad if Austria isn't really leading this competition just yet? And is it bad if national politics isn't very active there? Because what we've also heard is that, especially when it comes to platform economy, that employees from different countries work in many different countries and want to maybe offer their services in other countries other than their own. So maybe the national level isn't the right level to actually regulate here. So the EU Commission has made proposals in this regard. In the working program of the European Commission for the following legislative period, there are several proposals on how digital services and digital markets can be regulated. There have been 2 regulations already on this, and they are now being decided upon. And another thing is an initiative that's working on dignified, transparent working conditions for platform providers. That means an improvement of the working conditions within platform work. The Commission has, at the beginning of 2021, started a consultation process, and according to their working program, there will be a draft for a new law until the end of the year. So a little bit of time is left, and we'll decide, of course, within the European Parliament and with the national governments. So that means that the national governments and the national legislators will be important players there. National legislators will help decide this. And then it will be interesting to know what Austria's position is on this. We have seen that in an international context, Austria hasn't been doing very well when it comes to regulations. So could Austria, maybe be glad that the EU will take over from there, and Austria, can basically delegate this work to the EU and doesn't have to do it themselves. However, there is already a statement from the EU outlook for 2022 from the Austrian Labour Ministry, and it says in there about the Austrian position, at least the initial position. And what it says there is that that Austria is not very enthusiastic about this. It says that Austria, will look into this and will review this proposal, but since there's already so much legislation on it, it remains to be seen if new regulations are even needed. That's what it says there, and that it would be more important to extend the existing legislation. I will just leave you with this. I mean, maybe we can comment on this later. But let me ask you just one more question on this. How easy or difficult is it to really create European law here, especially when in so many areas it's really difficult to reconcile the different legal systems and you know, therefore create a European framework on top of that, a framework that will also work when it comes to implementing and executing this law in the member states.
Also eben, im Grunde ist oft ein Hinderungsgrund, dass es eben schon sehr viel national
Well, one of the backgrounds is that there is quite a lot of regulation already in many member states, and that means that digital markets may have an easier time in those states where there's not so much regulation, and maybe this can all be harmonized. That might be a reason why we could assume that maybe Austria, you know, wouldn't really mind if new regulations would come from the EU side and they wouldn't have to make them themselves. But that brings us to social law and to labor law. And on national levels, there are different regulations regarding this. And these will have to be harmonized. These will have to be reconciled. Or the other thing we could do is create a minimum solution on a European level that sort of mentions the issue and then leaves it up to the individual member states to shape what these regulations should look like. Thank you. Before we move on to the second round of discussions, we've got one question from the chat. Because you mentioned Italy, Spain, and France, where you said that there's a lot of regulation already in existence. And there's a lot going on when it comes to trying to find solutions. Do you know why it is, especially those countries that there's so much regulation going on there? Well, I can only assume, but I do think that it might be because it's bigger markets where platform economy has played a role earlier on already. The other reason might be that, especially when it comes to regulating labor law, that countries such as France, but also Italy and Spain are very progressive. And that might be a reason why. So it's not very surprising that they have already taken steps there. Thank you. I think we'll come back to these phenomena in the second round. Let me move back to Ms. Koch. You mentioned it already. You have just been to a conference that's called New Common Sense in Berlin, where platform cooperatives can have an exchange and can sort of exchange good practices, and information can be exchanged, and we can see what the individual countries have been doing. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. Yes, I would love to. I have just added a link to a little blog post that I've written. I've added that to the chat. And just in a nutshell, those that met in Berlin, that's the ones who want a different world, who want sustainability, who want participation, and dignified working conditions. And those were the ones that came together there. So why did we, as the Smart Cooperative, participate as well? Well, that's got to do with why I'm here today. We received funding, project funding, for the development of a digital tool from the Chamber of Labor. So whenever we get more users, then there's of course the danger to develop bugs, to do everything manually. And what we're trying to do is automated registrations, for example, automated commissioning of projects, etc. And at the same time, what we're trying to do is to create a participatory tool for the community development and governance, meaning that we can participate in decision-making on the interface of digital and analog aspects. And the nice thing about this tender was that the focus was on the participatory aspects, namely digitization of employees for employees. And therefore, we are also consulting with our team and our users and are engaging in this very exciting fundamental process. The way platform co-ops are being understood in Berlin is the following. It starts with city guides, for example, or bicycle delivery services, etc., that are all being organized via a platform, meaning I request a service and the work is directly linked with an online forum, for example. And I'm trying to kind of draw a big picture, but first let me draw a small picture. In Berlin, we've had a very encouraging example that we've witnessed. One of the more traditional platforms, either Deliveroo or Lieferando, has taken a step back from the German market, and the workers and employees have not just protested, but they have organized themselves with the help of an app that was provided by Co-op Cycle from France. And then they consulted Smart Germany, and as a collective, they are now employed in the Smart Cooperative in Germany. That's happened really recently, I think 6 months ago. So the vision is, a platform like Amazon, so not just small projects, but really large global companies. And we imagine that these huge platforms are in the hands of the employers, where they can decide on their own working conditions, where they can ensure fair payment, fair working conditions, where they have part ownership in the cooperative. So there's not an added value that just goes to third parties or goes into shares. And in Berlin, at the conference where I was, there were many different projects on this. Let me name just a few. There was, for example, an alternative to Airbnb that has sprouted up in Bologna called Fairbnb. They stand for sustainable tourism, and they donate 50% of their fees and earnings to local and regional projects, and are therefore at this very interesting interface between regional work and internationalism. There were also 2 platforms that work with data, care data, health data, for example, and they want to make sure that we can bring data back into our own ownership and make sure they're not just used by Facebook or Google, for example. How can we have ownership of our own data and determine what happens to our data? So very interesting examples that you can also read about in my blog. What else can I tell you? Well, there's also other interesting projects. For example, one was also on a regional level where people tried to install sort of like a Bitcoin system as a fair exchange of services, basically meaning that it could work within the co-op and has created basic income within the co-op. And they thought that they would, start on a small scale, but already 80,000 people have contacted them and want to participate. So it's really growing very quickly. These were all the big questions in Berlin when it comes to the scalability of all these alternative projects, if you will. But also what we talked about was one of the big questions of a scalability of democratic processes within these autonomous projects that are growing very quickly.
Und von daher möchte ich nochmal sagen, dass ich alle Kritik, und die Kritik war auch in Berlin sehr groß.
So I do see the criticism, and I see that a lot of things can go on within the platform co-ops, but there is a universe within we can exist and of which we can be a part, and that is actually quite encouraging.
Näher, und wir sind froh und auch stolz, da ein Teil
So
von.
we are really happy and proud to be part of this. There are fantastic examples. At present, the entire logistics sector, truckers in South Africa are self-organizing. That's a very important sector. And one last example. 2 years ago, prior to COVID, there was a very fine example of New York house workers organizing themselves, and they used to have a $15 hourly wage, and they presented it again, and they are actually organized in a collegiate structure, and they've actually raised their wages to $25 an hour. They've really grown, and every week they also have a self-determined exchange on how can we work, how do we want to work, what should our working conditions be like. So what I can see is great critical potential, but for me, when such projects are scalable, I think that there is great visionary potential worldwide. And practically speaking, if you're interested in SMART, and if you think this is interesting, we also work on our visibility. So please spread the word. On the 7th of December, you will find more information on our website. Sorry, I get feedback here. I'm sorry about that. Jörg, a forecast as to how this could develop in the next few years, turning the world of work upside down and back on its feet again. Is it that, or is it just one small segment, but the big world of Amazon will not be changed? Well, I think that the point is the number of such initiatives globally speaking, and how we can actually manage to stand our ground, how they can stand their ground against major corporations worldwide. In Austria, we've seen failure in getting on board in online trading. Kaufhaus Österreich was a major failure. Apart from these wonderful initiatives, it is important to build new and different things, while also making sure that traditional companies, Uber, Amazon, they are already traditional corporations, that something is done about them, and that disruption isn't simply taken the way it is, and that business models based on the precariat are perpetuated. This also goes for food delivery services. Those who do the job should not return to the 19th century or actually start from scratch in fighting for their workers' rights. the level of workers' rights that already exists since the 20th century should actually be introduced to the new business models. And the discussion has actually produced the idea that digitalization brings about change, and the state, the government, legislation has to come in, and legislation, unfortunately, is slow to react. Ms. Mühlbeck said the enforcement of existing rules also has to be borne in mind and has to be ensured. It's not just about new legislation for this new world. I think enforcement is also important, and there are very interesting examples. Enforcement also linked with new legislation. When we look at California, where there's been a long discussion about Uber and Lyft and other taxi services and platform companies, there was a Supreme Court decision, a Californian Supreme Court decision, no matter whether it's self-employed persons, which is what the corporation says, or whether it's employed workers. If a business model is based on the work of other people, these people are employees, they are workers. It might sound much too simple in our context for legal experts here, and much too simple for our legal system, but in California, a law was enacted, actually putting this into practice, but Lyft and Uber actually pushed for a referendum about this issue, and they put about $2 million into a campaign to actually get this law withdrawn. And 85% of the companies were against the legislation. Then another judge came up and said that this was unconstitutional. So it's a never-ending story. And it's my impression that it's about an IT company or a server farm somewhere. Actually, the authorities check out very carefully whether the construction rules are being adhered to. But if new business models are introduced, it is not ensured that this doesn't lead to the precariat, to precarious work. So enforcement would be much more important there. In the preliminary discussion, you actually mentioned something that is called social policy regression prohibition. So a prohibition to actually regress in terms of social legislation. Can you actually say something about that? Yeah, Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, actually gave a speech in front of striking workers in front of the Gare du Nord, and he said collective agreements and labor law achievements are civilization achievements on a par with the works of Mozart and Kant, and there must be a prohibition of regression so that there is no backlash and that you don't fall below the levels you have already achieved. And I think this is something that we can actually use here in our context. There are two interesting studies, one by Ms. Kohlenberger of the University of Economics on Amazon, and one by Jana Neuhauser which is entitled "When I Entered this hall, I returned to Iraq." This was funded by the Chamber of Labor, and this later study actually showed that the problem in a mail distribution center and in other sectors in online trading, people are temporary workers. Very often they are self-employed persons, and even if they feel ill, they don't stay home because then they can't, because they don't get sick pay, they don't have an employment contract, and given the low wages that they get, the low income that they get, mean that they just cannot afford staying home and not working. What does that mean in a pandemic where people receive lots and lots of parcels, when the parcel delivery service workers cannot go on sick leave? Imagine that. In the last 1.5 years, this wasn't broadly discussed to ensure that people actually get the fundamental rights and fundamental health protection when they work in such labor relationships, in such employee and worker or client and contractor relations. So it would be very important for a society to have this prohibition of regression. Why is it so hard to enforce? It's because it is largely invisible work. And this also has to do with the fact that it's work done by migrants. Migrants that arrived last, refugees, and they are largely invisible, and their working conditions are hardly noticed. So it is so difficult to
solche krassen Probleme anzugehen und hier Abhilfe zu schaffen.
Es hat ja einen Film gegeben, der einen Oscar gewonnen hat, namens Nomadland, nicht Nomadland, sondern Nomadland. Und da habe ich mir an zwei Dinge erinnern können, die Frances McDormand bewahrt.
And I remembered two things when Frances McDormand really remained dignified as a person, and she, didn't even want her own apartment. She lived in a trailer. And the other thing was about a platform a platform company where she usually works around Christmas time, and that was her, best employer over the entire year, which is ridiculous, and I was really quite impressed with that. Which leads me to my last question to Mr. Korunka, and also to the audience. Please do ask your questions if you have any in the meantime. So if you hear these examples, I think this really becomes very absolute in terms and relative at the same time, right? What do we need, do you think? What kind of support do we need as individuals from the society in order to maintain the absolute and relative dignity over our professional lives? And sorry, I just hesitated because I thought, I want to talk here because it's easy for me to talk about dignity in the workplace, right? Well, I would like to add one aspect that shows just how complex this whole thing is, and that's the generational issue, meaning if we talk about this type of work, we often talk about generational bias, and where we see that the Generation C has different needs. They may be more adaptable, but also are in a way very traditional. So these needs may be normative, but they do change constantly. And that kind of makes this whole evaluation a bit different. And then there's keywords such as self-regulation, for example, and that's something that new generations can learn to a certain extent. But I think it's also a problem of polarization if you just tell people that you have to regulate your life yourself. because if we look at HR areas and we find out which the best jobs are, then we know that the private sector, the public sector jobs, of course, and these are the different characteristics that people look for. And I do agree with my colleagues here that the framework conditions that we need must be made by the legislator. I think that's definitely their responsibility. I do think that we have to accept, though, that they cannot be too limiting. I think it was a very interesting discussion that we had about 2 years ago when it came to limiting working hours. Is a very complex topic, of course, because yes, we do want to limit working hours, but we also limit certain flexibilities. So it's a difficult topic.
I'll get back to that. There are many one-person businesses, and they say that's precisely what I want. I want to stay a one-person business. But Ms. Mühlberg, coming back to you, you also worked with another sociologist, and you looked at selective pressure among young people. Can you say a few words about that? Yeah, well, I think you're talking about the study with Bernard Kickler and Nadia Steiber of University of Vienna. We worked on youth unemployment, was a major project, and there was a second project, an EU project on values in work as they are passed on from parents to children, and attitudes of young adults and what influences them. And Professor Korunka said something that reminded me a lot of what applies to young workers. In our study, we saw that intrinsic motivation to work is very high. There is a high need for flexibility and independence, and also certain confidence in one's own skills. Sometimes actually people are a little too confident and they actually then fail in the labor market. And the platform economy would be something that is conducive to this wish for independence and for autonomy and self-organization. It's a kind of an entrepreneurial mindset that you get into. How can I build my career via those platforms? What is my personal business model? So that this opens up a lot of interesting perspectives that are important for the young generation, and interesting processes become possible. We also found, however, that the moment that young people experience unemployment, they become more interested in a secure workplace, in certainty, and that's kind of a loaded field. In the Austrian Corona panel actually checked the working life after COVID, and the majority of people say that they would like to have a choice whether they want to work from home, and free choice of working hours, and very little control by the employer. So this is something that we know from classic labor market research. A lot of flexibility and little control increases job satisfaction, but at the same time, people also want a secure workplace. And that's not possible. And the social security net that actually catches you when you lose your job. That's not what you find in the platform economy. And coming back to what Professor Flecker said, you just have to enforce existing legislation. That is correct. And I would actually call this into question slightly, because what the federal government meant by saying that the boundary between self-employed persons and people who are employed should be more clearly defined for the platform economy, so that everybody knows the rights that you have when you work in the platform economy. The problem is, once you are considered an employee who is entitled to social benefits, of course, labor costs rise and there is less flexibility, and it also might lead to an end to new developments that might be very welcome. So these are issues that would actually speak in favor of the platform economy. So we should look at the platform economy within the framework of legislation. Yeah, well, basically, if everybody buys via online platforms, this might also mean disruption, because brick and mortar shops might close and we won't find any physical shops anymore. Jörg, you actually raised your hand, you asked for the floor. Before you start talking, maybe you or a few other people from the panel could briefly say something about the California Supreme Court judgment. Ideologically speaking, this is very welcome to me. So if something is basically the same, it should be treated the same. Maybe the others might also want to say something about that. Ms. Kramer, you are the next in line. So this is also a question to you, in fact. You're probably not surprised by that. Jörg, please. Yeah, I just also wanted to take the floor and say that clearly in Austria, a discussion among lawyers has been going on for a long time about the concept, the notion of the employee. It's a long-standing discussion, and the term needs to be adjusted in its definition. There's also an interesting study about the platform work by Ms. Riesack, saying that this is actually fake self-employment, and that you should actually be treated as an employee if you work for a platform. So there is a need to adjust legislation to new developments to make it possible to actually catch all of this when you see the negative sides. 10% of helpers, of blue-collar workers who are only helpers and assistants have all-in contracts. They're not getting paid for overtime. That was not the purpose. As for flexibility, I think that workers can find a lot of flexibility in their employment contracts regarding working hours. There are various working hour models and working time models. In interviews, we often hear, I don't want a 9-to-5 job, I'd rather be self-employed. And then you go on asking questions and you find out that they cannot plan their working hours because they're actually dependent on their clients and they actually work all weekend. So it's also a kind of sour grape effect. I can't get secure job, so I actually praise what I have. So flexibility is not always what it seems to be. Self-employed people are not always more flexible than others. It depends on for how long you've been in the business and what your market position is. If you can also send clients away, you are flexible. But if you're looking for jobs all the time, you cannot even go on leave because somebody might call and have a job for you. So the fundamental idea of whether you would be in the way of new developments, you can say new things are welcome, but at the level of social standards that we've already reached. Employment contracts and sick pay, paid leave, and if the business model of platforms works out, it's welcome. But if it only works with precarious work, then we need to say this is not innovative, at least not socially innovative. And then you can actually turn down such business models as they are. I think it was a clear attempt in California as well as in the UK. We actually want to keep the minimum wages that are statutory minimum wages by saying, well, I'm not a taxi company, I'm actually a technology company, and the taxi drivers are actually self-employed, because this is a way around statutory minimum wages, and it leads to the precariat. When the judgment then says, or the Supreme Court ruling then says, there are companies behind these people, they are told where they should go, they work in shifts, so there is a company behind them. These people are also checked on an ongoing basis, they are employees, and for that reason they need to be paid the statutory minimum wages. Ms. Kramer. Two things that I would like to ask you. There was a meat factory in Germany, and a COVID cluster was detected there, and the working conditions were actually thematized in the papers. And I thought, well, this is similar to Amazon and Uber. So actually, this might be an example from a very traditional sector that actually exploits people who need money and a job. And secondly, I think there is an US ruling or judgment that says if it walks like a duck and if it quacks like a duck and if it looks like a duck, it must be a duck. So these are the two issues I would like to address in the final round. I think that you are the right person to actually close it and wrap it all up. Well, great that I am supposed to open up the final round of statements. Like not being treated as like this is something that we can see all the time, not just in the platform economy, not just in the digital sector. We see it there, but we also see it in meat factories where the working conditions were all around the media. And I need to mention at this point 24-hour nursing care is also a model for fake self-employment, and it is used in Austria in spite of legislation that would enable change there. It continues. So it's not always a lack of legal opportunities. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and I would like to tie in with what the preceding speaker said. We simply also have to enforce what we have in terms of legislation. And many phenomena of boundaries being blurred and also rights being taken away could be counteracted in terms of real policy. And real politics, we can say that the discourse is about the reduction of social standards so as to keep jobs, so as not to cut jobs. But in our round of speakers and beyond, we must make sure that social security protection and employment law is not put on the back burner. A little legal sidestep on when a duck is really a duck. Under Austrian social security law, there is the concept of the true economic content. And so no matter what you call it in a contract, the point is what you do and how you actually fill this with life. And in my opinion, the great cooperative solution has to include that. So that's a kind of a cautious comment on my part, because being employed by a cooperative can only be called employment with a cooperative if the true economic content corresponds to employment. I also wanted to mention enforcement of the legal framework. There are so-called checks of social security contributions that can be done ex officio if there is reason to suspect that there is social dumping and systematic wage dumping. And this is a very concrete step of looking at a platform from close up so as to redress the balance. But we also have to be cautious in case of platforms that are not actually located in the European Union or in Austria, if they have their seat elsewhere. Because then, for lack of an Austrian employer, the employees themselves would have to pay their own social security contributions. And this could, of course, backfire. So we need to bear that in mind when we talk about and then by way of conclusion, so we end on a positive note. We were able to reach out to those messenger services, delivery services. So we need to make sure that collective agreements are honored, but they're only part of the whole game. If somebody agrees to be self-employed as a bicycle delivery service worker, there's nothing we can't do about it. It's now 5:57. We had 2 very dense hours. I can't really see the what people think. So we have time for 2 more sentences if somebody cannot stand that. But I would actually now say that I'll move on to the conclusion. Anybody on the panel who would like to add it? We could, of course, also collect topics for further events in the series on digital humanism. And I would like to summarize that there are a number of ways and means to act. One is new forms of regulation. Another one is enforcing existing law. There is one that has to do with search for solidarity, for new models and self-organization, and ruses to think up new models where somebody can stand his or her ground as a self-employed person. And then, of course, in terms of attitudes, the fight for the prohibition of regression is very important. We had that at the very beginning of the event. And the question to be asked is, would I want to work in that job? I think that few people would like to see a society where one half lives on the other half of the work of the other half. So thank you very much, everybody. It was very intense in terms of work and exchange, like a seminar in the best in best sense of the word. And we will be back in February or March. We still have to come up with the topic, but it will be about digitalization and work again. I would like to thank all the speakers. I would like to thank the audience. It's now 6 p.m. and it's been a long day, but still you stayed with us. I would like to thank the co-organizers, CEU, most of all, because they actually made the infrastructure available. I will now go to ACV to get my third shot, my third COVID shot. So at some point, we will be able to do away with physical distancing. My plea to you is do everything to ensure that your environment, your surroundings, the people surrounding you stay healthy, and that you stay healthy. Thank you very much and goodbye. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.